Today is August 2nd, 2021. My name is Soleil Hanbury Lizzie. I will be recording on behalf of History Colorado, interviewing Marci Bowers, Dr. Marci Bowers. Um, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Sally. Thank you.
Great. Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Yeah, if you just want to, let's start at the beginning. If you want to tell me anything about how you sort of came into the medical profession, how you like what your early years were like, stuff like that.
Okay. So I guess I can dive way back.
Hmm.
I I was born in a suburb of Chicago. Grew up in southern Wisconsin. Very safe, very Midwest, very 1960s U.S. Never locked our doors. We didn't know, we thought everything was black and white. We were post-war babies. All the kids were above average, that kind of thing. It felt very Lake Wobegon in a way. Winters were long and cold. The world was very large, and we never got out of Wisconsin much. Many of my classmates had never left the state, let alone been to the nearest city, which was Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which for us was a 35-minute drive. But back then it seemed like a long way. So places like Colorado, places like California, they seemed very, very far, far away. And it's kind of magical spots that we would see on TV. But I was always a good student, and uh, I was the first of four children. So two younger sisters. In fact, my next sibling she's like 10 months younger, so she was like what we call an Irish twin. Um, and so we we were all very close. I was assigned male, but and I early on I had some very strong cross gender identification. I don't, it's funny. I always think, well, maybe it's just being around, two sisters all that time, because it wasn't until 9 years that my brother Pat came along. But on the other hand, um, yeah, I know lots of families where they'll have three, four, or five brothers, and yet the one of the siblings transitions to female. So I don't really think that has an influence. I think, as you know, when you have children, which I later had three children, after meeting my spouse at the University of Wisconsin as a sophomore, you realize that everyone is hardwired, especially from a gender perspective. And parents now that are coming through the process that have their children come out at a young age, people think that, well, how can you know who you are as a gendered individual that young? But you really do. And so these kids are playing that out today. But of course, in my day, there wasn't really any talk about it. There wasn't even any suggestion that you could be anything but what they told you you were. So it just wasn't in the playbook. And as a result, I just did the best I could in the body that I had. So that's how it went. Now, I suppose you could call those simpler times in that respect, but it wasn't really living authentic lives. And that's what I would argue now, is that really nature is dotted by diversity. I mean, it's punctuated by diversity. I mean, everything has diversity. So it really is not a surprise to me that gender identity would be defined by more than just male and female. And so I think it's actually a healthy evolution of the planet that we're getting to that point. But yeah, so for me, I did kind of did the things you had to do, and I, as the oldest of four, I was kind of had high expectations and had pressures put on me by my parents. I probably acted out a little more than I should have. I was probably a little more wild than any of the other kids. I certainly got into a lot more trouble. And, uh, whether it's, like first day of grade school, I was sent to the principal's office because I got in with another kid who, he later became kind of a juvenile delinquent. And somehow we ended up we found a lunch on the playground and ended up throwing the sandwiches against the wall and smashing the suckers and being really like, why, who does that? Like, who does that? But, that was I don't know, that was the time I was in, and it was, but I just had a nose for trouble. So anyway, but I was smart and did well. And so in those days, there weren't software engineers or other applications of intelligence other than kind of medicine was kind of a high pinnacle to reach, and it still is. But it wasn't externally imposed on me, but I did think it was a good place to put my talents. So that's kind of what I set my sights on, even though I didn't have any idea what it was to really be a doctor exactly, or how to get there. So once I got into medical school, though, that took some doing. It was punctuated by an attempt at transition. At 19 years old, I hitchhiked to San Diego and ended up in a cult briefly. The Unification Church. That was a whole chapter of its own. But I'll leave that for another day. But needless to say, I escaped the cult. I had to literally kind of break out of it and steal my own clothing back, which included my preferred gender clothing, which is probably the motivator that I needed. It was kind of I had that drive. I wasn't just going to be passive. I had a vision for what I wanted to do, and it wasn't in my assigned gender. So I did that, but then I found myself in medical school, and then in college, of course, then medical school, and I met my spouse and ended up having kids and having a career. And before you knew it, I was in my midlife moment, and had that existential crisis where I had to make a decision about who I was, and I was feeling increasing angst at being living my assigned life. And in fact, I chose obstetrics and gynecology because I thought I could kind of outrun it. I all along, I always thought that it was some kind of I didn't know if I wouldn't call it possession. It wasn't possessed, but I certainly, I couldn't distance myself from the issue of gender. And in spite of being very rational about it and very intelligent about it, I just couldn't do it. And it just kept coming back stronger. So ultimately, I transitioned, and that was while I was working as the department chairman of the chairperson of the largest OBGYN department in the state of Washington. So it was kind of a public evolution, and I took to the hormones like fish take to water. You might say. It was they agreed with me really well, and so the changes were obvious. So it was really kind of a surreal thing for the medical community, which really hadn't had much exposure to this. Meanwhile, Dr. Biber had been quietly practicing in this little town of Trinidad on the Santa Fe Trail in southern Colorado. And he had done that as a general surgeon when in 1969, a young social worker had come in and asked him to do her surgery. And he said yes, but without even knowing what her surgery was. And which is typical of Dr. Biber. He was a short man, but he stood very tall, and he always had a lot of confidence and calm about him. He was kind of a classy cowboy, I guess I would call him. And very fatherly, he just had he had a good way about him. So, so he did this surgery, and in those days, there were really very few choices in the U.S., let alone around the world. And so, following that procedure, shortly after, Johns Hopkins closed its program for treating gender dysphoria in Baltimore. And that set off a tidal wave of closures of similar programs around the US. In the 1960s, it was possible to get what they called sex change back then. Now we would call it gender confirmation or gender affirmation surgery, but back then it was called a sex change, which was, almost more dramatic, really. So ultimately, the Johns Hopkins closure shuttered all the other programs around the US because Johns Hopkins was the first and the most influential program of its kind. Even though, if you actually look at the numbers, they were opened, I think, in 1966, and they closed in 1979. But during that time, they'd taken in about 2,400 patients, but they'd only operated on a couple of dozen over all those years. So it left a lot of people really frustrated. If you were trans in the 1960s, it was really kind of a dead end. And you were also so heavily pathologized. There was no talk of diversity. There was no talk of, they just assumed you were crazy. If you had a penis and you thought you were feminine in any way, you were just crazy. And they even had psychiatric diagnoses for such things, like they did for homosexuality as well.
Was that how people kind of responded to you when you started transitioning at the hospital in Washington?
Yeah, I was at a place called the Polyclinic, and I think there was still a bit of that disease mentality that was there, for sure. But it wasn't unheard of by the late 1990s. Or I started transitioning in 95, 96, and right around the time of my son's birth, actually. So that was the third of my kids. So he's always known me as his mom, which is actually kind of cool. And still lives with me now today. After college, he came back, which kids do.
Yeah.
But anyway, but I think there was a sense of pathology, but there was a little more empathy and a lot more support than from colleagues than I think you'd actually imagine. People were amazingly supportive, and of course the shocking thing was that my patients, almost all of them stayed with me. I mean, really very, very few. I had very few who left my care, including the pastor of the largest evangelical church in Seattle. I delivered 2 of their kids as Mark, and then 2 as Marci, and they stayed with me through that whole time. Yeah. Other patients included, some an NCAA basketball player and his wife, delivering their twins, and just a lot of other high profile, generally well-to-do people. So it was what I found in a professional transition was that people with education tended to stay with me, and they tended to understand. Mm-hmm. And it was the people who were less educated and who reacted sometimes with their feet. They couldn't deal with, or if they were involved in their own personal crises, that was more than they could handle, which I really understood that. I had a couple of patients who had breast cancer diagnoses, and they left my care because that made sense to me, because they didn't want to they didn't have room for understanding or appreciating my situation. The fascinating thing is also, as over the years, I've had so many patients write to me and, with their own story about the time. And many of them were from patients who regretted leaving my care. They left my care, and they explained their situations in letters to me.
Mm.
So it was really touching. But when I transitioned in this large downtown Seattle hospital, the polyclinic or clinic at the time, I walked in and there were over 200 floral arrangements lining the halls, all the way down the halls on both sides. It was incredible. Rose bushes, just it was just a stunning moment. I just can't. I mean, it still sends shivers down my spine. It's just because you just touch. After delivering babies for 20 years in one area, you touch a lot of lives, and so it was really a nice thing for me. And I was in relative bliss there, and I never dreamed of getting into the gender surgery idea until I began. What happens is this seems like there's this 10% of the population that, I'll say 10%. I don't really know what the percent is, but it seems like it's this dark side of people that are they're staunchly conservative. They are, and they really think that they just think differently, and I mean, we see it today in all sorts of fields. They tend to be segregationists. They tend to be traditionalists. They tend to be moral, so-called moralists. They tend to be, et cetera, et cetera. And so those are people who feel like it's their job to dictate the morality of people around them, or be the police of the social order, if you will. And so they set out, and when they have their sights on you, they just don't let go until they ruin your life. But I think the lesson for anyone experiencing challenge in their life or disappointment is that any change can be a good change. And sometimes when one door shuts, another one opens. And you just have to be, as my mother said, you just have to read the tea leaves every day, which is the pattern that the tea makes at the bottom of your cup, I guess. And somehow that's supposed to tell a story.
Yeah.
I guess it's the Chinese proverb or whatever. So my mother's not Chinese either. She's Hungarian and Austrian, so I don't know where that came from. But so I had met Dr. Biber in 2000, right after it, like late May. And on the day of that, I remember two things about May 25th, 2000. And one was that he was on the cover of the USA Today that day, and it said "small town doctor." He had the entire page of the USA Today, which in that day was a big deal because a lot of people read papers, and there was no internet really, just starting. But and then the other thing was that there was still snow on the ground in Trinidad. There were little patches of snow, and I said, "Wow, that's a different town." I mean, even Wisconsin, we don't have snow on the ground in May. So anyway, when I ran into I guess it was a couple of years later, when this dark element I was mentioning sort of got the best of me and made it attractive for me to leave, I started looking for jobs and that were different than what I'd been in. And Planned Parenthood, and I had been recruited by other practice groups, and ultimately had accepted a job outside the city of Seattle where I could work a few days a week. It would be more part-time. I would have been the first woman there in their group. And I didn't, of course, back then, I didn't disclose to anyone. You didn't wear a scarlet letter on your forehead, or a T or something that would out yourself, because it was my medical information. And I really still feel that way, is that that's your decision to disclose your status is personal, and it's not for other people to talk about. And so I lived my life as a woman, and I was a woman OBGYN provider. And so that's the way I went about these interviews. And interestingly, one by one, I was outed eventually late in the process of each one, after being selected, because my credentials were amazing. I was class president in medical school, and I was, department chairperson, and so I was well credentialed. And I'd also had a lot of experience in pelvic surgery. So this is where, I just kind of, flipped the script a little bit. And once I was outed, I realized that I really can't hide from this anymore, and I'm just gonna be a public persona. And I'm gonna move. I brought my son, and my boyfriend at the time, and we moved to Trinidad, Colorado, and joined Stanley Biber in 2003. So of course that was a huge thing. Even so much bigger now when I look back on it than I thought of it at the time. I really thought I was kind of under the radar, like he was. He was kind of this small town doctor doing sex changes in this little community. And I said, isn't that cute? And we moved there as this little tight knit family. My son, we'd go to the barber there, and they'd cut his hair like my boyfriend's. And so it was kind of this short, spiky hair, and they look so cute together. And obviously I was also the parent. So, but with the haircut, it really looked like we were a biological family, so it was pretty adorable. But then, it just, of course, then some of the things that began to happen, I was contacted by a lot of media interest in this whole process. And I felt like it was a good thing and an appropriate thing to be educating people about, so that it's easier for the future. And of course, that too, meets with resistance. Not everybody likes the spotlight on them. And Trinidad kind of already had it. Stanley Biber had Geraldo there. He had him in the OR, and remember him opening the safe, whatever it was, from the Jesse James bank robbery or something, and there was nothing inside. So Geraldo was kind of the sensation, and he went there apparently for, to witness a sex change operation, and fainted in the OR. And then Michael Jackson was rumored to have to be undergoing a sex change, because of how much he kind of feminized his look. And so one day there was a rumor that he was going to be having his sex change in Trinidad. And literally, for this town of 9,000 people, they must have had 5 helicopters circling overhead over the city all day long, thinking that Michael Jackson was there. So yeah. So obviously that's the history I stepped into. And with this, with the media exposure, I've been, it just continued. So first it was a TLC documentary, and I thought, well, that'll be that. But then it's CNN, and it's the Learning Channel, and it's MSNBC, and it's, it's all the major networks, and Good Morning America, and then, Oprah, and all the things that ended up happening. Put more and more spotlight, because really, in a way, Dr. Biber's story was big, but my story was even bigger, because I was, and I would not have said that at the time. He had huge shoes to fill, but when I look back now, realizing that, I was the first woman in the world to do these surgeries, let alone woman with a trans history. So it was a really, really, really gigantic crash through the glass ceiling. And but that's also why, as they say, somebody said to me once, they said, you can tell the pioneers because they're the ones with the arrows in their back. And And that's what happened. It just was when you're high profile like that, people begin to attack you, and they find your weakness, they find your vulnerabilities, and they put you under a microscope. So that kind of gradually happened. Especially, it kind of accelerated after Dr. Biber passed away in 2006. That was a really surreal time for me. Remember, he had been practicing. I didn't join him until he was age 80. So I learned surgery from him when he was 80 years old. And after having had a whole slew of surgeons who had come through town hoping they would be the next Dr. Biber, he just felt none of those people had what it took. And as he said one time, he said, some didn't have the courage, some didn't have the hands, and some didn't have the heart. And so he, I don't know that he had any choices after me, but he apparently felt I had all three. So, so that was kind of cool. Anyway, how's that for a start?
I mean, that's a great start. I definitely think you have all three, but yeah, I guess I'm curious to know, like, how did you find did how did you find Trinidad, first of all? Like, did you think it was nice? Did you want to stay there? Like, what kind of made you want to stay there?
Well, so I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin called Oconomowoc, and it was actually about the same size. It's about 9,000 people. Now I think it's like 19,000. So it's really grown. But I read that small town feeling kind of resonated with me. Trinidad was very, very different than Oconomowoc, though. They both had lots of Victorian homes and buildings, so that was interesting that they shared that time period. But it also had a lot of the small town gossip and I don't know, not pettiness, maybe, I guess you'd say that. Somebody would say that. I never was bothered by that ever, really. I loved running into 5 or 6 people I knew in Safeway. Now, I mean, I'll go 5 or 6 months and go to every Safeway in the Bay Area, and I don't run into people I know. So so that was really a difference there, and I like that. I like the people there. It was a mix of Italian immigrants and Hispanic, probably more endemic people that had been there longer, and then a whole smattering of immigrants that had come through as a result of it being on the Santa Fe Trail. So it had a really rich cultural history, and I also just like the Latin people, and I like Hispanic. I like Italians. I tend to get along with Italians. In fact, I've dated a slew of them. I mean, they seem to be attracted to me. So ultimately, one of the fondest people in my life, Carol Cometto. She and I were partners for about 7-8 years there at the end. But it was a town full of characters. But it coming from metropolitan Seattle, where I was, downtown Seattle, and it was a high tech center, with Microsoft and the birthplace of Starbucks and Costco and Amazon. It was just kind of that was a real emerging city. And so having leaving that and going to small town Colorado, especially Trinidad, which was even more, really was very remote compared to like where I grew up. It was so far, from the Springs. It was an hour and a half, and Pueblo was about an hour to the north, and then Santa Fe was about 3 hours to the south. So it was and it really, more so than my town in Wisconsin, it felt like really, kind of in a time lock, like it felt just really, really preserved, uh, uh, Western, what do they call it? What do they call it in a Western, it's an art community, a Western coal community. I don't know. It was in a lot of the industries that I didn't quite, I didn't know about or didn't relate to. But let's see, it had a better moniker than that. But anyway, it definitely had its charms. But one thing it also had was just spectacular beauty, kind of in a raw Western beauty, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east and or to the west, and the and Fisher's Peak to the southeast. So it was, as it crossed through the Raton Pass towards New Mexico. So that, geographically, it was just spectacular. And I did what people do. I joined the ladies bowling team, first, or I guess it was first the couples bowling team, and then I was on the ladies bowling team. And I did, I got involved in the arts community, and I gardened, and I ended up meeting a lot of close friends. We had dinner parties, I swear, once or twice a week minimum. Some of the people there are big foodies, and of course I love Southwestern food. Green chili, is still a passion of mine. So, and I kind of I love the colors of the Southwest, so I tended to love the Mexican import art, so, I just embraced it, over time. But honestly, the first 6 months, I think it's hard. And this is a lesson also for anybody moving to a new place. It's really hard in the first, I'd say, 2 years to adjust to a new community. And you just have to give it time. But I did, because partly because I was so busy too. I mean, that was actually really helpful. But then gradually meeting people as you do, my community filled in around me, and so I had a community of friends, and ultimately that's what sustains, a healthy living situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was, it took time, but I loved it.
Yeah. You mentioned your relationship with Carol.
Yeah.
I suppose I just wanted to ask, like, was that kind of what kept you there for so long? Was that relationship, or were you like really invested in keeping the clinic going after Dr. Biber died?
Carol was a special person, and she's still a special person. She's there, to this day, and we're still very close, really. But the yeah, I mean, but I mean, when I first moved, my intention was to learn the surgery and go back to Seattle. But what I quickly learned is that even Seattle has a very conservative core to it, and so um, it, at least in the medical field, I don't think people think of Seattle as being liberal or as being conservative, but it doesn't take very long to get out of the center city and realize that it's really just as rural as a lot of places. But in medicine, it was particularly so. And so the idea of, doing sex changes in Seattle was like bringing a nuclear waste dump to a community park. It was like, people didn't want to do it. They were afraid they were going to alienate their investors. Honest to God, that's what I heard later, is that, was the big thing, is that their foundation, Swedish Medical Center, which was the biggest hospital there, their foundation had lots of conservative donors. And so if they pissed them off by doing these operations there, now, of course, every institution of any size is clamoring to get into the business, because they realized, one, there's money, but also the surgeries and the prestige of doing good work in this community is really, really big. So it's funny and I feel like I have some ownership of that change in people's attitudes, and that it has gotten better. And there is a better, there's greater access to care for trans patients.
Yeah, and it really seems to have exploded with your work. Like even Denver Health is expanding its surgery clinics there.
Yeah,
Um,
I started that program. I went there
yeah,
and worked with the doctors there.
yeah,
So it was, yeah.
yeah. Who did you work with?
Well, Chris Carey was the head of the GYN department there, and he was late in his career, but in the 1980s he had worked with a couple of transgender patients when he was in Oklahoma, which again unlikely. But he was a lot like Dr. Biber. He had that empathy. In fact, he was a friend of Dr. Biber's and used to refer patients that he saw to Dr. Biber when he was in Oklahoma. So, and he was a rancher. He was just like he really, the similarities are interesting. And but he thought the work was fascinating, and he always wanted to do it. And so he, as part of Denver Health, put out feelers, and one of them was to get me to recruit me to come. They expressed shock when I said yes, and then he got junior faculty to take up the mantle as well once, because he was very late in his career, and so the plan was to turn that over. So Jennifer Heyer and Rodrigo Donalicio, a urologist, both they have been terrific there, as well as a number of other, Liz Kabash, a lot of other support people at Denver Health. Very, very excellent, great hearts there, and it's I'm very proud that tradition has continued.
Mhm. Yeah, I that makes me kind of curious. Like, did Trinidad kind of open up this field that to like make these programs sort of possible in any way?
No, I mean,
Mhm.
it was Trinidad was great while Dr. Biber was alive, because he had a very unique connection to the community, as a general doctor and a family doctor. He was one of the last surgeons of his kind, where they would treat people for a head cold just as much as they deliver babies. They would set fractures, hip surgery, appendectomies. He kind of did everything that the community needed. And he did a reasonably good job in a lot of it. So as a result, he had a level of intimacy and trust with the community that I never really achieved, because of course although I was delivering babies in my early years there, and doing gynecology still, I wasn't, I didn't have any exposure to the men of the community, although there were a lot of them who were very supportive of me, and were great. But there were, again, that darker element, the 10% I talk about, that just don't, and Colorado Springs to the north is, arguably a little bit more conservative in its certain quarters. And so, so there was a lot of, uh, I won't say it's religious based, because I never like to completely throw religion under the bus, but I will say it provided them a bit of a bunker from which to operate in their intolerance. Yeah.
Mm.
So I think they exercise that intolerance and angst and disquiet about my being there. So they never wanted anybody else to come, certainly. And once I left, it just kind of was kind of like shut down and pushed away. I mean, even historians that have come through have kind of um, shut down that angle for Trinidad. They just want to get past it, and be it's a real shame because, that history is something that isn't, history is something that you can't sweep it under the rug. It's what happens. And every community should be proud of its history. And this is one, I think that in 1,000 years, it will be a very proud history. It may be very proud even in 100 years, but um, but but don't sweep it away.
Mhm.
It's a very good thing. It's a very modern thing that's happening, and you can't take that away. It's just that there are people that think that everything's prescribed by the Bible, and anything outside the Bible is just like I don't know what, demonic, no, or just it's not even. But yet there's so much in the Bible that actually there's like 58 references to eunuchs in the Bible. Um, so transgender people are and eunuchs and third spirit peoples are uh, in many quarters thought to be spiritual beings. This idea that they've got their many traditions of spirituality and spiritual thinking do include gender diversity.
Yeah. Um, and that's a great point because it's so fluid, and I think a lot of cultures have realized that over time, and it's kind of crazy that, you know, at this point we can also realize that. Um, so
Well,
do
we're
you
getting there. We're getting there. It's just that this is the my issue with for me. I respect people of faith because a lot of us have faith in I won't call it a higher power because then it makes it sound like a singular um, male figure, but I'll say, and if you trust, and it's trusting all of us, it's trust. That's what faith is. Faith is trust. And so when people begin to trust one another, that is really what religion boils down to. And so all of these fundamentalist religions, though, are based on a very separate and distinct division of maleness and femaleness. So there's just no room for that. They don't allow for that, and that's why organized religion falls short, I think, on a truly spiritual path.
Mhm. Yeah. So, yeah. It's a complicated question that, you know, I don't I definitely don't have the answer to. Um, but it's I like your answer. But I guess that those fundamentalist groups, do you really feel like they sort of pushed you out of Trinidad, or was it something else?
I think the law. I mean, we had a CFO who was educated at Bob Jones University, and which is a fundamentalist college and in South Carolina, I believe, and they, I mean, they basically have as a mission that they're training Christian soldiers to go out in the world and do God's work, which the CEO or CFO translated to be he got up in his congregation shortly after moving to Trinidad and said, "I'm here to rid Trinidad of its evil sex change industry." He basically said that. And then he did a bunch of steps that made it very difficult for me for a couple of years. I was eventually able to talk the cat out of the tree, when they realized the economic power of what I had. Trinidad unfortunately never realized the full economic power of what I was doing, because when I left, 95% of patients were still cash pay. But as we got broader and more comprehensive insurance coverage, hospitals have come to just reap enormous benefits from being able to provide this care. And it's unfortunate because I think even I don't know that my work wouldn't rival the marijuana industry, but let's just say it would be a significant would have been a significant help to the medical community there
Mhm.
had they supported me.
Yeah. If you had been able to stay, would you have wanted to?
I think it's really hard how fate takes you, and I did have some things that I had some very I'm very attuned spiritually. I will say that, and I mean, and I really do follow the clues and cues that push you one way or the other. So I had a few things that suggested that I should stay. But on the other hand, I think there is an awful lot that has happened that's good from my having moved to the Bay Area of California
Mhm.
in 2010.
Mhm.
Especially my ability to travel was greatly improved. Now I'm 10 minutes from an international airport where I can fly anywhere in the world. And in Trinidad, I was 2 hectic hours through mountain passes north to Colorado Springs, where I had to connect almost anywhere I went to. So that that's I guess I would say I'm grateful I don't have to make those long drives anymore. Although I always found them, they were beautiful and they were so relaxing. I mean, I enjoyed every minute of living in Colorado. It was really a very solitary, magnificent place.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you said it best. Even the drive from Denver to Pueblo can be taxing sometimes. So I
Yeah.
understand that.
Well, that
Um,
traffic got worse and worse too, through especially Springs to Denver. It just got it sometimes, it was it was pretty challenging at times, especially after a snowstorm or so there during a snowstorm.
mhm.
One time I came home super late at night and there was like a 7-year run of these moths. I don't know if you've ever seen these moths that come out at night. And it was more blinding than any snowstorm because the moths, as you drove through them, completely obscured your windshield. And so every 10 minutes you had to use wiper spray to clear your windshield, or you and I literally was looking through a little peephole as I crawled into Pueblo when I finally made it and was able to buy more washer fluid.
Mhm.
It was really a scary time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I don't think I've had to deal with that yet, though I'll be on the lookout for it.
yeah, this really interesting moth. It was heavier than a blizzard. It was amazing how many moths there were. I feel bad for how many I took out with my car, but um, it was just amazing.
Yeah.
And I miss the sunflowers going by the side of the road, and about this time of year, all the sunflowers that so surreal line all the highways and freeways all the way down. It's just such a gorgeous thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the snakes. I love the reptiles and the cactuses and the really hardy vegetation that would grow there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, it's a wonderful state. I love it. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it's sad that you moved away, but it sounds like you're doing a ton of like great work. I know you set up like international clinics all over the place. How is
yeah.
that?
We started the US's first transgender fellowship at Mount Sinai in New York, and where I'm still on faculty. I'm still on faculty at Denver Health and USC LA Children's as well.
Great.
So, I've done a lot of 5, 6 programs. Tel Aviv, I went to Israel
Mhm.
and restarted their program. So it's been very, very gratifying.
Yeah. Just changing tracks because I just remembered I had this question for you. But
Sure.
I know I personally have had a lot of experiences where I've looked back on things and been like, oh, I should have known right then that I was transgender. So I'm wondering if you have any memories of that sort of stuff where you look back and you're like, oh, that was so obvious then.
Oh, I mean, I was 3, 4 years old. I was wearing my sister's tights when I was, yeah, 4 years old. I remember I felt, I was made to feel shame about it for sure. And so I remember hiding under my sister's bed for like seemed like an hour while my father was like looking for me, and I was like, oh my God, it's like, oh. um so things like that were, yeah, so yeah, that's like earliest memories were always for me. I was a classic case, just a classic case.
Mhm. Yeah. And I guess, did that make your transition more like smoother for you, or was it a little rockier?
Well, it made it more definitive. I mean, I think this idea of people having regret is one of the most I recognize that people it happens to people, but I'll tell you, if you have these long-standing feelings where you've been trying to comply with your assigned gender for all those years and you still end up having to transition, once you do, you never, ever, 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 ever look back. I mean, I don't even look back for a second, not even a second.
Mhm.
So it's just like I am who I am,
Yeah.
and and I'm really happy with who I am.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I don't ever feel any like regret about what like anything I've undergone so far either. So I feel like that's a pretty big undercurrent in a lot of trans people's stories.
yeah, I think the thing that's so cool about being trans, and sometimes when people are experiencing a lot of hatred or they're having challenges getting through the process, um, what you have to go back to um, is that it's it does it just does get better, uh, it just, you have to do what's right for you.
Mhm.
You don't um, you have to be sensitive to people around you because it has a big effect, more of an effect on their life. And there's no real rule, so don't feel pressured to move forward on things either. So I mean, I was just recently on the 60 Minutes program about detransitioners, and the claim of the people who are detransitioned is that they only had 2 visits to a therapist, and then they were signing up for having their breasts removed. Let's say for these are transmasculine individuals, but I mean, who does that? I mean, who I if somebody just said, okay, you can be on these hormones for 2 months and then we're going to do a sex change like that. First of all, we have this organization WPATH that I'm president-elect of now. uh, we set up these kind of steps for people to go through. It takes time and you have to work this stuff out, and because things are not black and white, and you may want to stop somewhere in the middle, or you may want to just do a little something. But once you start doing surgical procedures that are permanent, that's on you. You sign that consent. You better do your homework. You better get second opinions. You better, or if it's long standing, don't even worry about it. You just, yes, there's complications that are possible, and you have to think about those things as possibilities. But I mean, I don't, that's, you have to take ownership. This is your life, and you have to do the things that satisfy the people around you, your loved ones, offspring. It's I used to say it's like walking on lily pads. You have to be very nimble and fluid. You have to be a little bit, just you have to be careful.
Mhm. Yeah. Do you ever have to deal with this sort of anxiety with like your patients? Do they come in with like a whole lot of kind of built up, like, I don't know if this is the best choice for me, or like any like regrets?
Almost never. I mean, I know I can tell you, and I really do keep touch with my patients too. But uh, I only know about uh, of three who ever expressed significant regret, and all of those were patients I operated on in Trinidad when I was very early on, and they had probably the quality of my surgery wasn't as good then as I was learning, but I also think that they were people that were maybe a little more non-traditional. They come from different backgrounds that maybe the diagnosis was slightly different, or maybe the answers for them was slightly different. And when you consider how difficult it is or was to transition, and all the shit that people sometimes get when they transition, so many people were fired from their jobs, and they live in poverty, or they live in jobs that were, you have software engineers that are working as cocktail waitresses, and suddenly, and things like that. Just and in spite of that, they're happier. I mean, and they don't detransition. That's the overwhelming reality. People don't regret the process. But I also think as we go futuristically, if there's not so much pressure to be binary, where you don't have to say, okay, so maybe you want to be a woman with a penis, or you want to be a man with breasts or a vagina or something. These are things that are a little futuristic, but I think as we recognize that this is more of a fluid, a spectrum, that's healthy too. How are we doing for time?
We still got a bit. I can go until I think about 12. Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of got all that. So, yeah. So I think one thing that's interesting is there's been a rise in transition surgeries over the years. So why are gender affirming surgeries over the years? Why is that? Well, the clear reason is that the barriers and the shame associated with being trans, by the examples that have been set by people, and I'll give Caitlyn Jenner, she's sort of a notorious figure in our community, because of her political stance, and I think a little bit of her, I'll just say, uh, social obtusiveness. She's lives in this bunker at the top of a hill in Malibu, and I like her as a person. I've met her. I've been in her home, and I just think she's she kind of says all the wrong things, if you know what I'm saying.
Mhm.
So, so if you're, she's argues against transgender women being able to compete in the Olympics, or in sport, which is, one of the silliest things, because she obviously doesn't know the science, where the muscle mass of trans women, it equilibrates, it drops, and becomes that of any other cisgender woman. This was borne out long ago by Renee Richards in the 1970s, who came out, as a professional women's tennis player, And then it was revealed that she was transgender. Actually, it didn't take much imagination to see that she was trans, although people didn't really look for trans back then, but she was clearly somebody who looked pretty masculine. But her body feminized and her muscle mass feminized. And what happens in these sports, sports, as you know, is a finesse sport. So muscle mass, no. Height, uh, that's a tough one. That certainly gives you an advantage, and that is one thing. If you're assigned male and you have male hormones and growth patterns, you might be tall, and so that may give you some advantage. But most sport is actually finesse and training, and so that's why the having the idea that young high school kids that are trans can't compete with their female peers, that's cruel. That's just like, okay, what do they have to do? Go to Special Olympics or something? I mean, come on. That I don't know. Or trans Olympics, are we gonna have to start that? That just seems it really marginalizes people and delegitimizes their femininity, or masculinity too. I think I mean, I know trans guys that are 6'4", six. I know I operated on a female assigned transgender basketball player who's assigned female, and he's 6'8". How do you tell me that he can't play on a men's basketball team? I'm calling bullshit on that one. I mean, give me a break. Of course he should be able to compete.
Yeah.
If he can dunk the ball, yeah, you get it. But and if he can shoot the ball like Steph Curry, damn right he should be able to compete.
Yeah. Is it harder to perform transmasculine surgeries or transfeminine surgeries?
Trans masculine surgeries have one big problem. One is that just don't think they're as advanced as they need to be. I think there's a lot more thinking that has to go into it. Right now, the surgery, I feel the main surgery, phalloplasty, is fairly disfiguring, and the alternative is that what's called metoidioplasty, which is using their original material. That kind of suffers in size, but functional, and satisfaction wise from a sexual standpoint, that the metas are actually shown increasingly that they come with much higher satisfaction than the phalloplasties. Phalloplasties really are kind of a gross, I will call it almost like a male representation of what an idealized penis is. It's kind of like when male plastic surgeons augment breasts. They tend to go for these like anime kind of characters with like enormous breasts, and instead of knowing, like as a gynecologist, I know what a female breast is like when it's unaugmented. And why aren't we going for that, for the natural look? That. So I'm always about, doing things as natural as possible. So I don't do fallows, I do metas. And metas are awesome. Sexually, their penises, they're just smaller. But they all have higher complication rates as compared to the male to female surgeries.
Yeah. So I guess do you handle more a higher volume of transfeminine patients comparative to transmasculine patients?
I do, because what happens, you'll see this with surgeons who are good at what they do, is they get more and more demand for their most popular surgery. And so if I do too much, I become a jack of all trades and a master of none. And what you'll see with the highest quality surgeons, I feel, they narrow the focus of their surgical offerings. And I think that and that's the responsible thing to do, is to narrow your focus as you go along in your career. You should do things that you do really well and leave what you don't do well to other people. So I do well with the metas, but I just don't, they take a lot of follow-up and a lot of time. And I just think that's something, I'm kind of leaving that door open for other people, young surgeons coming into the field.
Did Dr. Biber ever attempt them?
Dr. Biber actually has one of the, again, he was a different mindset. He did everything. And he kind of, he was very much an entrepreneur and a capitalist, I guess I'd say, where if there was a buck to be made, he kind of did that. So he was, I don't say that with any callousness. I mean, I think, I don't mean to say it's just a different set of values. And I think in a different time where he felt like he had to be there because there was nobody else doing the surgeries. So if he didn't do it, they didn't get done.
Was that the case by the time you came into the practice at Trinidad?
Yes, it was, but unfortunately, he hadn't done many phalloplasties at that point. But in his series, he's done, some said 1,500 phalloplasties. Now, we pulled his data from Mount San Rafael Hospital where I worked, and his numbers of the vaginoplasties are only about 23, just over 2,300. I am actually at 2,200 now, so I'm going to pass his number about. Let's see. I guess I'll be doing that 16 years earlier than he did, and that's because this is really all I do. So we started at age 45. Both of he and I were almost the identical age when we did our first vaginoplasty, and yet by my age currently, I'll have passed his legacy number 16 years earlier than he did.
Okay.
So
Wow.
I'll be the number one vaginoplasty by numbers in the US. I don't know about North America, but I think the US for sure.
Yeah, how many do you do about like a week or about a month, I guess?
I always did 5 to 6 in Trinidad per week, but I've really tried to slow down a little bit here and just really focus on the work I do and just really put out quality every time. So I'm down to now doing about 4 per week.
Wow. I mean,
still a lot of, compared
yeah.
to, you compare to surgeons in Europe or or areas of the country where they do smaller volume. They might do 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 a month, and we do 4 per week.
Okay. Yeah. So wow, we really do a lot here. Yeah. Do you ever? Is it very labor intensive? Do you ever wish you could kind of like go down to 1 or 2?
I think just for my own personal time and all the other competing things that I have to do in my life. Yeah, I think I'm kind of getting to that point, but not quite there yet. So I keep at it. Yeah.
Okay.
But listen, I think I have to go to see
All right.
patients. I'm sorry. I've got 4 surgeries this week, so I've got those people are waiting for me.
Well, so, I hope you the best of luck.
Actually, I have, if you add all the surgeries, I think I'm doing 10 surgeries this week. So it's yeah.
Wow.
So, but these are there. I also do lots of other things, like I was saying, metas and tracheal shaves and other things that are more minor. But and I also do clitoral restoration too. So a lot of these things are taking up my oxygen, and so So it's not like I don't do a lot of other surgeries too. And it's actually kind of helpful. It's interesting, it's necessary. And again, those surgeries, many people are just, there's nowhere else for those patients to go.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Yeah,
If you want to schedule a follow-up, I can definitely do that with you.
yeah.
But
Let's do that.